Our trip to Turkey was supposed to be the kind of escape we desperately needed. After 12 years of marriage, my wife, Sarah, and I had hit one of those phases. Nothing alarming, but there was a sense of distance that neither of us could shake. Turkey, with its ancient ruins, scenic landscapes, and tantalizing cuisine, seemed like the perfect place to reconnect. Sarah had always been the spontaneous one, suggesting exotic locations whenever we could scrape together the time and money. So, when she mentioned Turkey, I was all in. It wasn't long before I found myself looking at photos of Cappadocia's hot air balloons, the bustling Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, and the serene beaches in Antalya. We needed this. I needed this. Little did I know that the trip would change our lives in a way I never could have anticipated. The first few days were incredible. We spent our mornings wandering through Istanbul's winding street. At night, we'd relax with drinks at rooftop bars overlooking the Bosporus. There was something magical about watching the city lights twinkle as we sat close together, laughing and reminiscing. Those moments felt like a balm to the subtle wounds in our relationship. But as the days went by, I began to notice a certain restlessness in Sarah. She would disappear into her phone for longer stretches, texting someone with a smile on her face that I hadn't seen in a while. When I'd ask her who she was chatting with, she'd say something vague about a friend from work. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I was probably just overthinking things. She was here with me, wasn't she? It was on our 5th day in Istanbul that Sarah suggested we visit one of the famous Turkish baths, the hammams. It's one of those once-in-a-lifetime experiences, she said, her eyes twinkling with excitement. We can unwind, get a massage. It'll be good for both of us. The idea sounded nice enough. I'd read about Turkish hammams and how they offered a blend of cleansing rituals and relaxation. So, we made our way to a traditional bathhouse, one tucked away in an ancient part of the city, famous for its authentic ambience and luxurious treatments. As we walked in, the scent of eucalyptus and lavender filled the air. The soft murmur of water and gentle echoes of people chatting in Turkish added a kind of mystical quality to the space. We were shown to separate sections, as is the tradition in many Turkish baths, with women and men having their own areas. Sarah looked a bit disappointed that we couldn't go through the experience together, but she quickly shrugged it off. "I'll meet you afterward," she said with a grin, then disappeared down the tiled corridor. Inside the men's area, I was guided through a series of warm and hot rooms, sweating out every bit of tension I'd been carrying. The masseuse assigned to me was thorough, and after about an hour of scrubbing and massage, I felt like I'd been reborn. By the time I was done, I was expecting to see Sarah waiting for me. But when I returned to the front of the bathhouse, she was nowhere in sight. I waited for about 20 minutes before a small, uneasy feeling crept in. I couldn't shake the odd sensation that something was off. Finally, I asked one of the attendants if he'd seen her. "Your wife?" "Yes, she is still with the masseurs," he said in broken English, motioning toward the women's area with a polite smile. That should have reassured me, but something about his smile left me unsettled. Still, I told myself that I was being paranoid. It was a busy day. Maybe the masseurs were just taking extra time with her treatment. I sat down in the lounge area, nursing a small cup of Turkish tea while I waited, wondering if she was feeling as rejuvenated as I was. But minutes turned to an hour. By now, other patrons who had arrived after us were already leaving. I checked my phone. No messages, no updates. The polite smile of the attendants began to seem almost mocking. I decided to walk over to the women's area and inquire again. The attendant looked up, a hint of discomfort flickering across his face before he quickly masked it with another polite smile. "She's still in massage," he said, then looked away, avoiding my eyes. Something felt wrong, but I didn't know how to press the issue without sounding like a paranoid husband. After another 30 minutes of pacing and waiting, Sarah finally emerged, her hair slightly damp, her face flushed. She looked different. Relaxed, yes, but almost too much, like she'd been drinking some secret elixir of confidence. I approached her, feigning casualness. "You were in there for a while," I said with a laugh, trying to mask the unease that was now clawing at my insides. She flashed me a smile, her eyes sparkling in a way I hadn't seen in years. "It was amazing, Sam. Probably the best massage I've ever had." Then, Almost too quickly, she added. Sorry I kept you waiting. They just took their time. It was a strange way to phrase it, and something about the way her eyes darted away as she spoke left a sour taste in my mouth. But as we left the hammam and walked back to the hotel, she was unusually affectionate, wrapping her arm around me, laughing at every little joke I made, and even leaning in to kiss me on the cheek every so often. It felt almost like we were young again, just two people in love exploring a beautiful foreign city. And maybe that's why I decided to ignore the nagging doubts clawing at the edges of my mind. If she was happy, if she was here with me, maybe that was all that mattered. At least, that's what I told myself. The next morning, I woke up to find Sarah already awake, sitting by the hotel window with a cup of coffee in her hands, gazing at the sunrise. She looked peaceful, almost lost in her own world. When she noticed I was awake, she shot me a bright smile, her whole face lighting up. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she teased, a touch more cheerful than usual. We spent that day exploring the ancient ruins around Ephesus. But as the day wore on, something felt off. Sarah was enthusiastic, taking picture after picture, laughing and acting carefree. But now and then, I'd catch her checking her phone with a certain look, one she would quickly cover with a smile if she saw me noticing. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just my insecurities bubbling up again. But as the day wore on, that smile of hers began to feel forced, like it was hiding something. At dinner that night, I decided to bring it up, though I didn't want to come off as paranoid. I mentioned how much she'd been on her phone, hoping she'd brush it off with some casual answer. But she just laughed, saying it was her friend from work again. "She's just keeping me updated on things back home," she said, waving it off with an easy smile. I wanted to believe her, but something in her expression didn't sit right with me. The rest of the evening felt tense, though I tried to act like nothing was wrong. After we returned to our hotel, Sarah went to take a shower, leaving her phone on the bedside table. A message popped up on her screen, one that I could see from where I was sitting: "Missing you already." My heart raced, my mind immediately jumping to the worst conclusions. Who was she missing? I stared at the message, fighting the urge to unlock her phone. Sarah and I had always trusted each other, rarely prying into each other's personal things. But in that moment, the need to know burned like an itch I couldn't ignore. My hand hovered over her phone, but just then, she came out of the bathroom, her hair damp and loose around her shoulders. I quickly moved my hand away, pretending to scroll through my own phone. I couldn't bring myself to ask her about the message. My mind was already spinning with explanations. Maybe it was a friend, or someone from her family, someone who had a different way of expressing themselves. But deep down, I could feel something was wrong. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the events of the past few days. The extended massage, the strange text, her newfound spark. It all swirled around in my head. Just as I felt myself drifting off to sleep, I heard the soft sound of her phone buzzing again. This time, she was lying beside me, her breathing even and slow. The glow of her screen lit up the darkness, and in the faint light, I could see the same name from before. I shifted closer to her, my heart pounding. I could just make out the message on her screen: "Can't stop thinking about you." In that moment, everything inside me went cold. I could no longer ignore what was happening. But I couldn't confront her, not here. Not in a foreign country where we were supposed to be on a romantic getaway. I needed to handle this delicately, find some proof or explanation before saying anything. The following day, I tried to mask my unease as we continued our tour through Turkey. We visited more historical sites, took a ferry ride along the Bosporus, and even stopped at a small seaside cafe for lunch. But every time she looked at her phone, my stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and dread. Finally, later that evening, as we returned to our hotel, I took a deep breath and decided to confront her. I didn't want to accuse her outright, but I couldn't keep this tension bottled up any longer. "Sarah," I asked as we sat on the hotel room's balcony, watching the night sky. She looked at me, surprised, and then her expression shifted, almost guarded. "What do you mean?" she asked, playing it off with a nervous laugh. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I just feel like you're distracted. Like something's on your mind that you're not telling me." Sarah looked away, fiddling with the edge of her napkin. I'm sorry if I've seemed distant, she said softly, her eyes fixed on the distant lights of the city. I guess I just have a lot on my mind. Work, things back home. You know how it is. I could feel her deflecting, steering the conversation away. But there was something in her voice, a flicker of hesitation, a crack in the cheerful facade she'd been wearing since that day at the bathhouse. I wanted to push her, to tell her about the messages I'd seen. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the hope that I was wrong, that I was letting paranoia ruin what was supposed to be a special trip. So, I let it go, forcing myself to smile and pretend that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew I was walking a tightrope. Something had shifted between us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, with every passing moment, she was slipping further away. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, while Sarah slept peacefully beside me, I lay wide awake, every nerve in my body taut with suspicion. The messages, the unusual behaviors, the evasiveness, all of it pointed to something more than just stress from work. I kept reminding myself of the Sarah I knew, the woman I'd loved for years. I tried to convince myself that there had to be a rational explanation, but the questions gnawed at me, the ache of doubt sharper than any pain I'd ever known. Early the next morning, I slipped out of bed and went downstairs to the hotel's cafe, hoping a change of scenery and a cup of Turkish coffee might help clear my head. As I sat there, staring blankly at the table, an idea formed, a desperate plan, but one I couldn't shake. I needed to know the truth, and I wasn't going to find it by asking Sarah directly. When she came down to join me for breakfast, I was already prepared. I suggested we spend the day relaxing by the beach, just the two of us, taking in some sun and unwinding. She looked genuinely pleased with the idea, and I took that as a good sign. After breakfast, I made an excuse about needing to check on our travel arrangements for later in the week. "Why don't you go ahead to the beach?" I suggested, handing her a towel. "I'll meet you there in a bit." She nodded, kissed me on the cheek, and headed off toward the shore. As soon as she was gone, I made my way to the hotel lobby and asked the front desk if they could direct me to the bathhouse we'd visited on our first day. The concierge looked at me curiously, but I brushed it off, pretending I'd forgotten something there. With an address in hand, I took a cab, feeling my pulse quicken as we approached the familiar old building. The bathhouse seemed quiet when I walked in, the scent of eucalyptus hanging in the air. I went straight to the receptionist's desk, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Excuse me," I said, lowering my voice. "My wife and I visited a few days ago, and I believe she left something in the women's massage area. Could you check if it was turned in?" The woman behind the desk looked at me skeptically, but eventually nodded. "I can ask one of the attendants," she said, her tone polite but distant. While she stepped away, I surveyed the small lobby. It was an elegant, timeless place, with intricate tile work and soft lighting. Yet today, it felt menacing, as though the very walls were hiding something from me. The receptionist returned with an older woman who seemed to be in charge of the women's massage area. Her gaze was sharp, as if she'd seen my kind before. Husbands with questions they didn't really want answers to. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" she asked in heavily accented English. I hesitated, feeling my resolve waver. "Actually, I was wondering if you remember my wife, Sarah," I ventured. "She had a massage here a few days ago. I believe it was quite long." Her eyes flickered with a knowing look, but she quickly masked it. "Yes, I remember her," she said slowly. "She received one of our more personalized massages." "Personalized?" I repeated, my voice dropping. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. The woman shrugged, her expression unreadable. "She requested a full massage session, more than what we usually provide," she said carefully, choosing her words as if she were walking through a minefield. "It's not uncommon for guests to want an extended experience. But that doesn't usually happen, does it?" I pressed. "An hour, maybe, but 2? Her face tightened. I could tell I was pushing too hard, making her uncomfortable. "Sir," she began, her tone measured, "what happens in our massage rooms is private. Our clients come here to relax and enjoy themselves. If your wife booked an extended session, that's between her and the masseurs." The word masseurs made something click in my mind. Wait, you said masseurs? As in more than one? She pressed her lips together and gave a slight nod. We sometimes have two attendants, yes, for guests who prefer it. I felt like the ground was slipping from beneath me. The images that flashed through my mind were ones I desperately wanted to shake off. Did she specifically ask for this arrangement? I asked, barely able to get the words out. The woman didn't answer. Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I stumbled out of the bathhouse, my heart racing, while rising in my throat. My mind spun with questions and suspicions I couldn't ignore anymore. Sarah had booked a private session with two masseurs, spending hours with them, while I'd sat waiting, completely in the dark. I took a cab back to the hotel, feeling like a stranger in my own life. When I returned to our room, Sarah was already back from the beach, freshened up and humming to herself as she applied sunscreen. She turned to me with a bright smile, her eyes filled with a warmth that now felt alien. "Ready for another day of adventure?" she asked, her tone light. I managed a nod, struggling to mask the storm inside me. Part of me wanted to confront her right then, demand answers for everything I'd learned. But another part of me wasn't ready to hear whatever excuses or explanations she might offer. Instead, I suggested we take a walk along the cliffs. I needed time to think, a quiet moment to process the betrayal I was almost certain she'd committed. We spent the rest of the day in silence, the tension between us thick and unspoken. She sensed something was wrong but didn't press, leaving me to wrestle with the gnawing truth I could no longer avoid. That night, as she lay asleep beside me, I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed a plan, some way to get answers, and maybe, just maybe, the start of a way to get back at her. The next day, I would set things in motion. And this time, Sarah wouldn't see it coming. The morning after my visit to the bathhouse, I woke up with a plan. A clear, cold determination that felt foreign yet strangely empowering. I couldn't confront Sarah head-on without solid proof. I knew that. And I couldn't live in this limbo, pretending I didn't know what was going on. I needed to know everything if I was going to confront her and, more importantly, if I was going to take my revenge. I suggested to Sarah that we visit the bustling Grand Bazaar. She seemed pleased, immediately immersing herself in choosing an outfit and texting away on her phone, likely giving someone the play-by-play of our plans. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was messaging someone, maybe one of those masseurs from the bathhouse. My stomach twisted with the thought, but I swallowed it, forcing myself to smile. In the bazaar, I watched her closely. She moved with an energy I hadn't seen in a long time, her eyes sparkling as she admired jewelry, silk scarves, and hand-painted ceramics. For anyone else, we'd have looked like the perfect couple, laughing, buying trinkets, sharing plates of Turkish delight. But beneath it all, my mind was racing, tracking her every glance and movement. After a while, I noticed her stealing glances at her phone, fidgeting in that subtle way people do when they're eagerly waiting for a message. I was sick of watching her pretend, tired of wondering, so I decided to speed things along. I leaned in close to her, slipping an arm around her waist. "I was thinking," I said with a grin, "why don't we split up for a bit? I know you love taking your time in places like this, and I want to grab something for you without you peeking." Her eyes widened, and I caught a flicker of something. A mix of relief and excitement, perhaps. "Oh, sure, that sounds fun," she replied, a little too quickly. "I'll just be over by the jewelry stalls. Take your time." I kissed her cheek and walked away, pretending to blend into the crowd. But instead, I looped back around, keeping a safe distance so I could see her without being seen. Not 10 minutes passed before she slipped out of the bazaar and started down one of the narrow, winding alleys that branched off from the main streets. She kept looking over her shoulder, her phone gripped tightly in her hand as she walked with purpose. My heart pounded as I followed, careful to keep my distance. Eventually, she turned down a narrow passage that opened into a secluded courtyard. I watched from the shadows as she sat down on a low stone bench, nervously glancing around. I was about to step closer when I saw two men approach her, the same two men I'd glimpsed briefly at the bathhouse. The moment I saw them, a chill ran through me. They looked casual, but there was a familiarity in the way they greeted her, the kind of ease that didn't belong between strangers. They exchanged a few quiet words, and then one of the men reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face in a gesture far too intimate for my liking. I clenched my fists, barely able to contain the fury boiling up inside me. I wanted to storm over, to confront all three of them right there, to demand an explanation, even if I already knew it. But I forced myself to stay hidden. I needed to see just how far she'd go. After a few moments of conversation, they stood and began walking down another alley. Sarah glanced back over her shoulder, as if making sure no one had followed her, her face flushed with excitement. They disappeared into the shadows, leaving me with nothing but a sick feeling and the certainty that my wife was betraying me in ways I hadn't even imagined. I returned to the hotel, my mind buzzing with rage and disbelief. I wanted to confront her, to unleash every ounce of anger boiling inside me, but I knew I had to wait. Rushing into a confrontation would only give her a chance to talk her way out of it. I needed to set a trap, something that would ensure she couldn't wriggle free. That night, I feigned exhaustion and went to bed early. Sarah joined me a little later, slipping into bed beside me with a kind of lazy contentment. It sickened me to think she could come back to me after whatever she'd done with those men, acting as if nothing had happened. As she lay beside me, lost in sleep, I made my move. I'd spent years working in IT and knew a few tricks for accessing secure devices. I carefully took her phone, syncing it with my laptop and downloading every app she had. It didn't take long to find the incriminating evidence I'd been looking for. Text after text, photo after photo, messages exchanged with both men over the course of weeks. They were explicit, full of details I didn't want to imagine, and confirmed everything I'd feared and more. My wife had been having an affair with not one, but two men she'd met in Turkey. They'd planned every encounter, keeping me oblivious while they indulged in God knows what. My fingers hovered over the messages, my chest tight with anger. But even as I felt the rage rise, I knew that simply confronting her wasn't enough. She'd lied to me, betrayed me, and treated me like a fool. I wasn't just going to expose her. I was going to make her feel the same helplessness, the same burning shame. I spent the next day carefully gathering more evidence, forwarding every message and photo to an encrypted account. By the time Sarah woke up, I'd already planned my next move. We spent the day as if nothing was wrong, walking along the cliffs and taking a final ferry ride along the Bosporus. I played the part of the doting husband perfectly, hiding my disgust and anger behind a mask of charm and affection. She had no idea what was coming. That night, after a final dinner by the water, I suggested one last trip to the bathhouse. One more chance to unwind before we head home, I said, keeping my tone light. Sarah looked a bit wary but agreed. Sure, why not? She replied, her voice a little too casual. When we arrived, I spoke with the manager, arranging for us to have the private couple's suite. Sarah's expression shifted to one of pleasant surprise. She thought this was some kind of romantic gesture, a final olive branch. Little did she know, I had other plans in mind. We changed into our robes, and as we waited in the suite, I casually brought up the trip. It's been such a memorable vacation, hasn't it? I said, my voice calm. Absolutely, she replied, her eyes bright. It was everything I hoped it would be. I felt a surge of anger at her response, but I kept my face neutral. In the bathhouse, I continued, that first experience you had here, it must have been unforgettable. Her eyes darted away, and she shifted uncomfortably. Yes, it was nice, she said, her tone hesitant. Nice? Just nice? I pressed, watching as the color drained from her face. You seemed pretty taken with it, maybe even with some of the staff? Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked caught, panicked, as if she'd suddenly realized she'd walked into a trap. Sarah, I continued, leaning in, my voice barely a whisper. I know about the messages. I know about them. Her face went white and she stammered, it's not what you think. I was just. Oh, I think it's exactly what I think, I replied, my tone icy. You lied to me, humiliated me. And you did it here, on what was supposed to be our chance to reconnect. She started to cry, reaching for my hand, but I pulled away. Save it, I said, standing up. The two of us? We're done. But first, you're going to pay for what you did." The panic in her eyes grew, and I savored the satisfaction of seeing her squirm. She had no idea just how much worse things were about to get. As I left her in the bathhouse, Sarah sat there, pale and speechless, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. She tried to stammer out apologies, but I was done with words. I turned and walked out, leaving her there to think about the consequences of her actions. She hadn't even begun to realize what was coming. When we returned to the hotel later that night, I kept my distance, speaking to her in short, cold sentences. Her attempts at explanations and apologies fell on deaf ears. I watched as panic set in, her mind racing, trying to figure out just how much I knew and what I was going to do next. Little did she know, I was only getting started. The next morning, as we packed for our flight home, I made sure to keep my laptop and phone secure. Everything I had, every message, every photo, every video, I'd already transferred to a secure file and backed up. I even had copies saved to a private account, one she'd never find, no matter how hard she tried. I was calm, patient. I knew that once we returned home, I could finally set my plan into full motion. As we boarded the plane, Sarah tried once again to explain herself, saying it was a momentary lapse and that she never meant for it to happen. She looked up at me with tear-filled eyes, trying to reach for my hand, but I pulled away, giving her a cold, dismissive glance. I could see the hurt in her expression, but I felt nothing. After what she'd done, she deserved everything that was coming. When we landed back home, I told her I needed a few days alone to process everything. She tried to argue, to beg me to stay, but I had already rented a separate apartment for myself. I packed a small bag, grabbed my essentials, and left without a backward glance. I could hear her crying as I shut the door, but it only steeled my resolve. From that point, everything moved quickly. I contacted a lawyer, laying out my case in detail and showing him the evidence I'd collected. He assured me that, given the circumstances, I had a solid advantage. I would keep our house, our assets, and ensure she walked away with nothing. Every dollar she'd taken for granted, every luxury she'd enjoyed, would be stripped away. But I wasn't stopping at the divorce. I'd done some research and found out that her workplace had a strict policy regarding relationships outside of work. Although her affair had been with two men she met on our trip, I knew I could twist the story to fit the narrative her company wouldn't like. I crafted an anonymous letter detailing her extracurricular activities and how she'd been careless enough to leave traces of her escapades. Within a few days, I heard from one of her colleagues that she'd been called into HR. She had no idea it was me, and the bewilderment in her eyes when she returned home that night told me everything I needed to know. One after another, the pieces of her life were falling apart. For weeks, I played the part of the distant, hurt husband, telling her I needed more time. She began to unravel, trying everything to make it right. Flowers, messages, promises to go to therapy. But I ignored it all, watching as her desperation grew. Then, when she thought things couldn't get worse, I made my final move. I posted the evidence online, discreetly, of course, in a way that couldn't be traced back to me. Within days, friends, family, and acquaintances saw what she'd done, complete with photos, dates, and every sordid detail she'd shared with those men. She called me, hysterical, sobbing that her family was ashamed, that she couldn't go to work, that people were cutting ties with her. She begged me to take the posts down, but by then, they had already gone viral. Finally, after weeks of playing the long game, I confronted her one last time, setting down the divorce papers in front of her. I told her she'd get nothing, that I had evidence enough to ensure she'd walk away with barely a penny. "But we were happy," she sobbed, clinging to my arm. "I made a mistake, but I love you, I swear. Please don't do this." I leaned down, meeting her tear-streaked gaze, and said the words I'd been waiting to say for weeks. "You didn't just make a mistake, Sarah. You chose to betray me, over and over again. Now you're going to live with that choice for the rest of your life." I walked away without another word, leaving her there, devastated and alone. The divorce was finalized within a few months. She lost her job, her reputation, and most of her friends. Our assets remained largely in my control, and I moved into a new place, finally free from the shadow of her betrayal. As for Sarah, she tried to rebuild, tried to find people who'd take pity on her. But the damage was done. Her actions had left her isolated, shunned, and barely scraping by. Every once in a while, I'd get a message from her, long, rambling apologies, pleased to meet and talk. But I never responded. I had nothing left to say to her. The life we'd built was gone, but in its place, I'd finally found peace. Sarah was left with the memory of her choices, the ashes of what she destroyed, and the knowledge that her betrayal had cost her everything. And for me, that was enough.